Oliver loved finding old things, especially antiques. He believed that every old object had a story, a memory of the people who once owned it. So when he came across the large mirror at an estate sale in a quiet English village, he felt an instant connection to it. The mirror was tall and heavy, with a dark wooden frame covered in detailed carvings of swirling patterns. Though the glass was a bit cloudy, Oliver loved the way it looked. It felt like the kind of mirror that belonged in an old manor house, one that had seen many lives pass by. Surprisingly, the mirror wasn't very expensive. The seller, an older woman named Mrs. Hastings, seemed eager to get rid of it. She told Oliver that the mirror had been in her family for many years, but she didn't know much about it. "It belonged to my grandmother," Mrs. Hastings said with a casual shrug, "but I never liked it. It always gave me an odd feeling." Oliver didn't think much of her words. People didn't always appreciate antiques like he did. Without hesitation, he bought the mirror and decided it would look perfect in the hallway of his new home, right outside his bedroom. That night, after hanging the mirror on the wall, Oliver stood back to admire it. The soft hallway light made the carvings on the wooden frame look even more detailed, almost alive. There was something strange yet beautiful about the mirror in his modern home. Oliver liked how it added character to the space. But over the next few days, things started to feel a little strange. At first, it was easy to ignore. The mirror seemed to catch his attention every time he passed by, almost like it was calling him. Sometimes, out of the corner of his eye, Oliver thought he saw movement in the reflection. But when he turned to look directly into the mirror, there was nothing there, just his own reflection and the quiet hallway behind him. One evening, as he was brushing his hair in front of the mirror, Oliver noticed something odd. The reflection in the mirror seemed a bit different from the real hallway behind him. The colors looked duller, almost like a faded photograph. The light in the reflection seemed dim, even though the living room lights were bright. Frowning, Oliver leaned closer to the mirror. Was the glass dirty? As he leaned in, his breath fogged up the glass, and for a brief second he saw something else. There, in the fogged part of the mirror, was a face pale and hollow, with wide, dark eyes staring back at him. His heart skipped a beat, and he quickly stepped back, his eyes wide with fear. But when he looked again, the face was gone. The mirror showed nothing but his own reflection and the empty hallway. Trying to calm himself, Oliver shook his head. "I must be tired," he whispered to himself, turning away from the mirror. But the feeling of being watched stayed with him, making him uneasy. That night, Oliver lay in bed, his mind racing. He tried to convince himself that it was nothing, just his imagination. But as he looked at the dark hallway where the mirror hung, a heavy feeling of dread washed over him. It was as if the air around the mirror had become colder, thicker. He eventually fell asleep, but his rest was far from peaceful. In the middle of the night, Oliver woke up to a soft tapping sound. At first he thought it was his imagination, but the sound continued, a gentle knocking, like someone tapping on glass. He sat up in bed, holding his breath. The sound was coming from the hallway, from the mirror. Heart pounding, Oliver got out of bed. The house was completely silent, except for the steady tapping, which grew louder as he walked toward the mirror. He stopped at the edge of the hallway, staring at the shadowy outline of the mirror on the wall. The tapping stopped the moment he reached it. Frozen in place, Oliver's eyes locked on the surface of the mirror. His reflection stared back at him, but the hallway behind him in the mirror looked even darker than before. Cautiously, he leaned in closer, his hand shaking as he reached out to touch the cold glass. The second his fingers touched the glass, he saw it again, the face. This time it was clearer, more vivid. A pale face with wide, unblinking eyes stared back at him from behind his reflection. The figure stood there, completely still, just watching. With a gasp, Oliver spun around, but the hallway was empty. Terrified, he turned back to the mirror, but the face had disappeared once again. Only his own reflection remained. Breathing heavily, Oliver stepped away from the mirror and hurried back to his bedroom, slamming the door behind him. He spent the rest of the night wide awake, his mind replaying the face he had seen in the mirror over and over again. The next morning, feeling exhausted and frightened, Oliver decided to call his best friend James. He explained everything to James, though he felt a little foolish talking about it. As he described the strange face in the mirror, he could see doubt creeping into James's eyes. "Oliver, you're probably just stressed," James said in a calm voice. "Sometimes old mirrors can look weird because of the way they reflect light. Maybe you just imagined it." "I know what I saw," Oliver replied firmly. "There's something wrong with that mirror. It's watching me." James looked at his friend with concern but agreed to stay the night, just to ease Oliver's mind. They spent the evening watching movies, hoping to distract themselves. But as the night grew later, Oliver couldn't shake the uneasy feeling. Every time he glanced toward the hallway, where the mirror hung, a chill ran down his spine. Around midnight, the house became eerily quiet. Oliver and James sat on the couch, feeling the tension build. Suddenly, James's body tensed and his eyes grew wide as he stared at the hallway. "What is that?" James whispered, his voice shaking. Oliver followed his gaze and froze. The blanket he had thrown over the mirror earlier was now lying on the floor, as if it had been pulled off. The mirror was uncovered, and in the dim light, Oliver could see it clearly. His reflection stared back at him from the couch, but behind his reflection, something was moving in the shadows. And then slowly the pale face appeared again. This time it wasn't just a face. A tall, shadowy figure stood behind Oliver's reflection, its dark, hollow eyes fixed on him. The figure's mouth stretched into a wide, unnatural smile. Oliver grabbed James's arm. "We need to get out of here." They bolted from the couch and ran for the front door. But just as they reached it, the door slammed shut on its own, shaking the walls with a loud thud. The entire house seemed to groan, the lights flickering, casting strange shadows across the walls. The tapping sound started again, but this time it was much louder, echoing through the house. It wasn't coming from the mirror anymore, it was all around them, surrounding them. Oliver and James backed away from the door, their eyes fixed on the hallway. The figure in the mirror had stepped out. It was no longer trapped in the glass. It stood at the end of the hallway, slowly moving toward them. Its lifeless, pale face was terrifying, and its eyes, dark and empty, never blinked. The figure's body twisted and jerked unnaturally as it moved closer. James screamed, grabbing a chair and hurling it at the mirror. The glass shattered into hundreds of pieces, scattering across the floor. For a brief moment, everything went silent. But then the figure let out a low, horrible growl. Its body twisted and bent in unnatural ways as it stepped over the broken glass, still moving toward them. The lights flickered again, casting its shadow long and terrifying across the floor. Oliver and James backed into a corner, their hearts racing with fear. The figure loomed over them, its cold, unnatural breath brushing against their faces. Oliver closed his eyes, preparing for the worst, but suddenly everything stopped. The house fell completely silent. The air, which had felt heavy and cold moments ago, was still. Slowly, Oliver opened his eyes. The figure was gone. The mirror was shattered, and the eerie presence that had filled the house seemed to have disappeared. Oliver let out a shaky breath and turned to James. "I think it's over," Oliver whispered. But James didn't answer. His eyes were wide with terror, his mouth hanging open in a silent scream. Following James's gaze, Oliver looked down at the shards of glass on the floor. In each shard, the pale, twisted face was still there, staring back at them from every broken piece. The mirror was shattered, but whatever had been inside it was far from gone. Now it was free. The Explorer signing off.